Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to be trying to give you guys a little overview of just war theory on the Edexcel A-level specification. I do hope this is useful. I spent quite a bit of time making this presentation and I've tried to summarise things as best I can, and I will explain them in more detail as I go along. So to begin with, we've just got some examples of wars. These are for you to research yourself, see whether or not you think they're just, so look at the like before the war, during the war and after the war. There's also World War I and World War II you can use. Basically, this is just for your own research and for examples you can use in your essays. We've also got the purposes of war from different perspectives, which might be useful in an 8 marker. You can just make a quick note of this. I'm not going to expand on it because it's all there. Right. So, before the war, Jus ad bellum. As you can see at the top, we've got the 3 lovely people who came up with just war theory, and before the war they say you should have a just cause, it should be waged by a just authority, there should be a just intention, proportionality should be a last resort, there should be a reasonable chance of success, and you should look at comparative justice. And to look at this in more detail, we've got various lovely people who talk about it in more detail. So we've got Vardy, who talks about the just cause being open and inclusive. So it could be to achieve a decent human existence, it could be against extreme humanitarian issues. Xu suggests it's defence against aggression, although humanitarian intervention isn't necessarily mentioned here. And it could also be too complex. Just cause just means you're not going to war for the sake of furthering your own ideas. It should be to help people as a defence, should be for good reasons. It should also be waged by a just authority. So Aquinas says it shouldn't be waged by individuals because they have other means of sorting out conflicts, such as the courts. And a negative of this is it's relative. So is only the UN a just authority? Is God the only just authority? Or are religious leaders a just authority? It's all culturally relative, so this is quite a difficult clause in before the war. There should also be a just intention. So Aquinas says this should be to advance good, so not for revenge. And Vardy once again points out this is culturally relative. So with the case of Italy and Ethiopia, Italy invaded in order to establish Catholicism, claiming this was a just intention. Except now we'd be looking at that and we'd be like, no, that's not a just intention. So it all depends sort of on the situation, so it's very difficult to establish this clearly. It should also be a last resort, but as Cody says, not every option has to be explored, because some just delay the inevitable, and that's just going to make war worse when it actually happens. It's also quite subjective, because what is exploring every option? There are some which you know won't work, so why should you waste so much time looking into everything? There should also be a reasonable chance of success, but Vardy says this increases the eventual destruction. So you can sort of consider here the Cold War. If that had actually resulted in a physical fight, we'd probably all be dead. So saying that you need a reasonable chance of success will just lead to a build-up of weapons, which in the end is going to be worse than if you just went to war with a low chance of success. It's also complex. You can't predict the outcome of a war. There might be someone who you think's going to lose and they actually win. So I mean, in the Vietnam War, the Americans didn't think they'd lose and they did. So it's very, very complex. This also means that smaller and weaker countries couldn't wage war, which isn't necessarily fair. But then Cody points out that if there are desperate circumstances, you can just go to war even with a low chance of success. For example, a serious infringement of human rights, or like a threat. So there's also the consideration of comparative justice. So Vardy says there's justice on both sides and you should look at it from both perspectives. That might mean you're unwilling to fight, which is a good thing because you do want to avoid war wherever possible. Right, now during the war, Jus in Bello. So there should be proportionality and discrimination, so you shouldn't harm civilians. I put Vietnam War as an example here again, which I'll go into in more detail later. So Cody talks about intention, so you shouldn't intend to harm civilians. So in the Vietnam War, it might have been more difficult, but if you're not going out there directly to harm civilians, it's still alright. Xu says attacking civilians to undermine morale is rubbish, so you should avoid it wherever possible. And Bowie says that civilians supporting an unprovoked war are guiltier than the soldiers defending. So these are all good things for a 12 marker. And then after the war, Jus Post Bellum. And this was put forward by this lovely Canadian philosopher whose name is down there. And it involves punishment, proportionality, discrimination, compensation, and rights vindication, all of which I'll explain after I've gone through the scholars. So there's not really many for this. Tony Blair and liberal interventionism, bit dodgy, but you know. There's also an example of proportionality as World War I. As I said, I'm going to go into this in more detail now. So for punishment, there should be punishment for war crimes, for example, the Nuremberg trials, and this should be on both sides. So even the victors should have punishments for those who have gone against just war theory. Proportionality. So the punishment should be proportional. So the reason I put World War I as an example there is Germany were completely destroyed and that led to World War II. So that was not a proportional response and that meant that the war was not just. There should also be discrimination, so you shouldn't target civilians in the punishment. It should be the army leaders or the people involved in the war. There should also be compensation for any losses on both sides, and in terms of rights vindication, any rights that have been revoked prior or during the war should be restored. Right, and then I've got some evaluations. So the weaknesses. Jus says that just war is an oxymoron. War is not just. Wink says no war is just because you're trying to put yourself above your opponent. So if just means equal, war can never be just. And Holmes says that just war theory encourages war, which is not what people want. It's also difficult to enforce, it's damaging to both parties, it's too complex and it's too open. Vardy says it's impractical, and you should also consider political realism. So if someone says, oh yeah, well my intention is to help these people, well no, your intention is probably to further your own interests. So for example, there's sort of a little bit of a joke going around that America always wants oil, but they will hide that behind a different intention. So really, can a war ever be just, even if it claims that's its intention? There's also the fact that governments will always be preferring their own citizens and what they want, so it's very difficult for you to be fair. But there are strengths, so it's realistic. It recognises that war is sometimes necessary. It brings ethics into an area where they are needed. It's an internationally recognised theory. It's relevant to Christian thought and secular thought, and principles are clear and comprehensive. Obviously, the alternative to war is pacifism, and there are multiple forms of this. So there's absolute pacifism, like Quakers, Martin Luther King, and they will not use violence in any case. There's also contingent pacifism. If you're in a reasonable position to use violence for peace, you should do so. Otherwise, you should be a pacifist. There is also personal pacifism, like Augustine. Protect others, but don't use violence to protect yourself. There is also nuclear pacifism, where you won't use nuclear weapons, but you will use other forms of violence. In terms of absolute pacifism, you also have the conscientious objectors during the war, and the church has recently changed their position on these people, which I will go into later. So the weaknesses. Neighbour, using Genesis 3, says we are fallen, and we should use force to restrain people from evil. Singer says that omission, so not acting, is morally equivalent to the act of violence because it ends in the same consequence. And Graham says not to act when you could is moral self-indulgence. So there's reasonable, like if you're in a reasonable position to act, you should, essentially. There's also Christian realism once again, that we are fallen, and also the cases of self-defense. As for the strength, you can consider that maybe God is the only just authority, because biblical war is always waged by God. That means that mankind should not wage war, meaning we should be pacifists. Long also talks about the theological significance of pacifism, so the church, as I said, has changed its position on conscientious objectors. The cost of war is too great and should be avoided, and meeting violence with violence does not lead to peace. And there is also the loss of civilians, war is wasteful, and war dehumanises. So, pacifism can be good, but also, if you're going to be better off using violence to restrain people from doing evil, you should. And that's why just war theory is there. Some people argue that just war theory is outdated because the new weapons that we have mean it's very difficult to be proportional. And also, it's a very old theory, so people will say it's outdated. But it does appeal to Christian and secular thought. So I do hope this was useful. I hope I haven't forgotten anything. I did go through my folder and got as much as I can. So yeah, if you enjoyed this and found this useful, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe, turn the notification bell on, and leave a comment if there's anything you would like to see next. So I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye!